Chuck, I'd like to ask two pretty fundamental questions, and maybe these will kind of tee off our conversation. First, I wonder if you could give me just a paragraph of thought on how you would define the social, or possibly the social world, by which I mean the objective study of the social sciences. That will be one question. And then the other question is, how would you define, again, kind of in a paragraph, sort of the script for the social sciences generally, what is a good body of knowledge or a body of representation about the social? So partly it's ontology, how do you think of the social world? And partly it's epistemology, how do you think about what good social science knowledge ought to look like?
Well, I mean, the two are closely related. And I've already given you partial answers. I just want to crystallize those answers. The social is people interacting and the products of that interaction. And that's pretty big, but the social is pretty big. And if you're going to do a science of the social, obviously you have to be able to figure out what a person is. That's a problem, and we've already talked about that a little bit. And you also have to be able to figure out what an interaction is, and that has its own problems.
Mm-hmm.
Nevertheless, that for me defines at least the center of the realm. The boundary is uncertain. You know, what about indirect interaction? What about the diffusion of news along long chains? Well, it all passes through interaction one way or another. What about interactions with the environment? Well, okay.
Well, what about large entities of the sort that you've studied throughout a lot of your career, things like the state or the world trading system or Protestant religion? Those are big things. How do you relate that to the transaction picture?
Well, they are compounds of transactions.
Okay.
And they are recurrent patterns in the transactions. Now, I mean, to shift to your second question, which is vitally linked to the first question, you absolutely have to have a way of observing the interactions. That is, you have to be able to specify the persons you're talking about, and that's not so easy. You mentioned earlier the question of variable biographies, for example, and trajectories that lead to the present moment. None of this is easy, but having specified a set of persons, then you have to be able to observe that the interactions, transactions is the term I prefer, the relations, that is the recurrent features of those transactions, and start working on the mechanisms that occur within those transactions.
And so the state and taxation, for example, the state has a policy in Paris, but the peasant who is taxed in the countryside, his or her behavior is influenced by state policy, and then you would amplify your story by saying, yes, and that's through a series of kind of hierarchical transactions.
Yeah, I have a book in press right now called Contentious Performances, which is the culmination, I hope, of all that work we talked about earlier on Great Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. And what I try to do there is to show that it's possible to take the interaction at a small scale. Here is a weaver shouting at a master. To compound that particular interaction and others like it into a description of what I call performances. I mean, we don't need to talk about the theatrical metaphor, although it's important to this particular line of work, but the idea is that there's an occasion in which all the weavers come out and they're shouting at the masters and some interaction occurs, well, we could stop there and tell the story of this particular encounter between weavers and masters. Or we can say, you know, the next day another group of weavers from the same section of London showed up and did something like a repeat on the performance. We can now link these two events with each other. Mm-hmm. And we can start compounding. And what I try to do in the book, I think more successfully than I've done before, is to show that seamlessly you can compound these to a picture of the whole pattern of interaction in Great Britain over a long period of time. A transformation of contentious interaction over the period that I'm studying. And that there's a technical problem of aggregation, but it's perfectly possible to show, for example, what the most frequent interactions of this kind are, to abstract from these individual events those relations which consist of a subordinate dissing a superordinate or something like that. And by analogy, it's perfectly possible to take the king's finance minister in Paris or Versailles and the peasant whom a tax farmer is belaboring in some village in the Dordogne, and find the link of relations that connect them. I mean, it's not easy. Empirically, it's very demanding, but that in principle...
But the logic.
Yeah, the logic is fairly straightforward.
Right. And that's what defeats a kind of brainless structuralism.
Yes.
Which says the state decrees and the tax system works.
Yeah.
What you're adding is the connective social mechanisms or the connective transactional networks, I think, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, when Doug McAdams, Sid Terrell, and I first tried to codify this line of thought in dynamics of contention, we said, you know, we pretty well have to distinguish three kinds of mechanisms. I mean, this is crude, but let's distinguish between cognitive mechanisms, where we can imagine one brain, one consciousness at a time operating. Environmental mechanisms, where the people are interacting with the resources around them in one way or another. And interactive mechanisms, or interpersonal mechanisms, and so forth. And what we say in the book, but I don't think establish with total conviction, is that the interactive mechanisms are the ones that are crucial for the formation of social processes. And so part of the polemic that we carried on in dynamics of contention was precisely to say, sure, you got to pay some attention to the environmental mechanisms. Sure, you've got to pay some attention to the cognitive mechanisms. They're all part of the same causal story, and we wouldn't want to draw the boundaries too tightly. But the study of contentious politics has suffered from too much attention to environmental and cognitive mechanisms, not enough attention to transactions.
Here's my last question for you, Chuck. Sociology is, well, I guess I'll ask you, do you think sociology is in a great condition today with boundless opportunities for new discovery and new illumination, or are we in some trouble in sociology?
Oh, I think we're in some trouble, but we've been in some trouble for 150 years. I think the trouble is a little worse right now because we're still recovering from the onslaught of skepticism that arose with postmodern thinking and various forms of cultural reductionism during the 1980s and especially the 1990s. And so I mean, I love philosophical discussion, so that's not what I'm about to say, but I think too much of the debate in sociology today is unself-conscious philosophical disagreement. It's disagreement about epistemology and ontology rather than about explanation.
Mhm.
And I don't think that's such a great position to be in.